You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Well, good morning from Washington, D.C. and the East-West Center. We're delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, Is America Losing East Asia? Economic Stakes of Asia-Pacific Cooperation Post-COVID-19. My name is Satu Lemay. I'm the Vice President of the East-West Center and the Director of its office in Washington, D.C. And I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by two eminent economists, trade economists in particular, Dr. Peter Petri, who holds the chair, Carl J. Shapiro Professor of International Finance at Brandeis University, and Dr. Michael Plummer, who is the Director of SAIS Europe and the Ennie Professor of International Economics at Johns Hopkins University. As many of you who are joining us, and I know there's been a great interest in this program and the speakers, will know that they have written extensively on the issues they intend to discuss today, which include US-China trade relations, globalization, a regional comprehensive economic partnership, and other arrangements for trade and commerce throughout the East Asia and the Pacific region, and of course involving the US. They have a PowerPoint and are going to speak for 20-25 minutes or so, and then we'll move to Q&A. You have received the protocol instructions to use the Q&A section for submitting your questions, and to use the chat section if you have a particular point on the ongoing discussion, sort of the virtual version of the two-finger intervention. I know many people are joining us from all over the world today at different times in different places. We welcome you all to this East-West Center webinar. And with that, let me please just invite first our presenters to begin their presentation. I want to just flag one thing I forgot to mention. Both Michael and Peter have had long standing relations with the East-West Center. Michael is currently a non-resident fellow of the East-West Center, and Peter Petri has served in that role in years past. So it's sort of in our spirit of alumni from the East-West Center as part of our 60 Minutes for 60th anniversary as well. Thank you both for joining us, and over to you for the program.
Thank you very much, Satu. It's a real pleasure to join you and everyone else on this webinar. I just want to say it's a pleasure to be back at the East-West Center, though I must admit doing it in person in Honolulu is better than Zoom, but so be it. We will be talking about East Asia. This has been an area of interest for both of us for a very long time. East Asia, as you know, is a kind of the poster child of international trade over the last 70 or so years, an extraordinary history of very rapid growth of trade and also of trade agreements. It has been a very active region in concluding trade agreements within itself and with countries all around the world. RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, 15 East Asian countries involved, is by some measure the largest yet. It's about 30% of the world's economy. It's about 30% of the world's population. And in June, by Zoom, the 15 RCEP members have agreed to sign the agreement in November. So it is coming. It's been a long time coming, but it does finally seem to be converging. And it's converging, curiously, unfortunately, without India, which was a member of the negotiations until the very end when it withdrew from it. So that's the second point that I wanted to make, is that that East Asian trade agreements in this last round with RCEP and the CPTPP, the successor of the TPP agreement from which the United States pulled out, is now essentially pursuing mostly regional or regional-centered agreements. These trends, frankly, tend to isolate the United States, which had very strong relationships with the East Asian economy. And if they do that, the US will miss out on a very promising period of growth, which East Asia is in the middle of and is likely to continue for a while. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is a terrible disaster for the United States. We have a very strong, resilient economy, but it is a lost opportunity. It's a pretty big lost opportunity if it happens. And so what the US can do about this is something that I think we should very seriously think about and talk about. And I hope this seminar represents a kind of first step in that process. We don't have specific, very specific recommendations for what the US needs to do, but I think we have some ideas and it's something that we should discuss. Our paper is the most recent in a long series, over a dozen papers and books that have applied computable general equilibrium modeling to understand East Asian trade agreements, proposals for agreements, and so on. And it has this version of it, by the way, there is this whole list of these is a set of references that we can give you either individually or perhaps they will be on the East West Center website. I'm not sure how we do it, but one way or another, we can easily provide you with references to them. This last paper has two novel aspects. The first one is that it does explicitly include the US-China trade war. And the way it includes it is essentially by assuming that the phase one agreement concluded in January will essentially stay in place through the next decade or so. Our results are long run results, so that this assumption that it will stay in place for a decade or so is very important to the results. Second, it looks at RCEP and in its kind of most recent version as the 15 members agreed, and without India, as I mentioned earlier. We will make 4 points, and we will try to focus our discussion just on the results and on kind of pretty specific points in order to give us as much time for discussion as possible. The 4 points are, first, there appears to be a shift from globalization to regionalization going on in the world economy. And what is the meaning for that for the United States? Second, that the US-China trade war is very costly if you look at it in a long-term setting. But those costs can be mitigated by greater integration away from the United States. And we'll see that happening in the process of the trade agreements that we study. The trade agreement, and the third point is that these trade agreements, these policies are beginning to decouple or will likely decouple over this decade in the future, the United States from East Asia. It's akin to beginning to draw a line down the middle of the Pacific, something that Secretary of State Jim Baker was afraid of nearly 30 years ago now. The last point is that this also gives China an unusual opportunity, an opportunity on the one hand to build, or on the other hand to not build, a beneficial, mutually beneficial, rules-oriented East Asian trading system. And whether or not it does that will have a lot to do with potentially stopping the free fall in global economic cooperation, which we have seen in recent years. So let me go to the first point. The global economy appears to be shifting from globalization to regionalization. We can demonstrate this in the projected results from the trade war and from the trade agreements that are now being put in place. But the causes are obviously more speculative. I can list them. All of us have some of those in mind. The return of nationalism to politics across the world, the perception of increased risk from international supply chain, which is a result on the one hand of the US-China trade war, on the other hand of the COVID epidemic. I think Mike and I are a bit skeptical about this. I mean, if you concentrate your supply chains nationally and something hits your own economy, that can be very, very risky, and the diversification which one gets from international supply chains can be risk mitigating. But this is a story that I think needs to be examined more. The absence of multilateral leadership. And one might even go so far as to say US obstructionism based on its America First policies. The list is long, you know, the opposition to various multilateral institutions, the withdrawal from new trade agreements that include multilateral partners, and no, really, if one looks hard, no substantial results from the efforts of the current administration to forge new trade linkages. And add to that, and I think this is another reason for regionalization, is that the regional supply chains are very robust and very strong. They're especially so in Asia, and there's been a lot of growth in Asia. So in addition to the negative factors, there is this very strong positive pull of the regional integration of the growth and integration of the Asian economy. So the implications for the U.S. are, as you might guess, we might miss East Asian growth, which is likely to continue robustly. The high levels of investment that originate in East Asia, and some of the very promising technological advances that the region is making. So those are all very strong compared to our other non-East Asian partners. So that's why, now whether, you know, that's not, you know, make it or break it for the American economy. We are fortunate, very, very fortunate to be large and continental and innovative. And so it's not make it or break it, but it is a significant lost opportunity, potentially. So let me now turn on, we have only 3 slides. We wanted to keep the discussion quite simple. So let me turn on the first slide, which I'll talk about, and then Mike will talk about the next 2. So this is, okay, let me just, give me a second. I think I've got this under control. Okay, so this is the first of the 3, this is just an introduction, but the first of the 3 slides I wanted to talk about is this. And, oops. Okay. This slide shows a series of experiments that we have conducted with our model. And it's really put together from several different papers. So but since the model is the same, we are comparing apples to apples, so to speak, in terms of results. But it shows long-term effects for 2030 of 5 different experiments. And 0 is the baseline, but the 5 different experiments then show the incremental global income gains in 2030 and thereafter. These are kind of annual results. So it's per annum that you see these gains in terms of billions of US dollars. If the trade war is sustained, that's the first negative orangish slice, and then positive incremental slices if various trade agreements are then concluded. The trade war itself, as you can see, is a pretty large negative hit to the world economy, $300 billion. It shows up in small percentages, but it shows up in global income estimates for 2030. And it's a result of a great deal of reshuffling of trade between the United States and China to other partners on the one hand, and to some extent to domestic industries. The trade war, as I mentioned earlier, assumes phase 1 levels. There has been some, actually, if one looks closely, there has been some deterioration in the trade climate since phase 1. So it doesn't include that, but includes a fairly sustained large hit. Now the second and the third bars show the effects of the CPTPP, the successor to the TPP agreement without the United States, and of RCEP on top of a trade war environment. And as you can see together, they actually offset or slightly more than offset the effects of the trade war. Now, they do that for the world as a whole, and especially for competitors of China and the United States in various markets, but they don't offset the effects of the trade war for China and the United States itself. And I should mention that China has the larger of the two, has the larger negative effects of the two countries. So much of the trade war at this stage falls on China. The CPTPP actually amplifies somewhat China's loss. RCEP then mitigates it quite substantially. RCEP's greatest benefits of that $209 billion positive benefit to the world as a whole go to China, Japan, and Korea. The reason they do is these are large economies, closely interdependent already, and RCEP is their first free trade agreement that they jointly participate in. RCEP is not as strong an agreement as the TPP or CPTPP in terms of its rules, but it does have very advantageous rules of origin, which means it stimulates supply chains. And our results suggest that it's likely to do that for China, Japan, and Korea together. But the most interesting parts are the last two and much more speculative bars is what happens if this trend toward East Asian integration continues and amplifies. The first one is what if the CPTPP agreement is joined by China? That adds an additional $485 billion. As you know, Premier Li Keqiang a couple of months ago had proposed that China is taking the CPTPP very seriously and might be interested in joining. And then the last piece is what if 5 other regional economies, all of which had at one point or another indicated their interest in joining the CPTPP, also join. And with China as a member particularly, I think the advantages would be great. Now, somewhere in the line, along the line, you might ask, well, shouldn't the United States be in this picture someplace? And we think it should be, but that's a discussion to be had at a later stage. So, bottom line, and I'll stop there, the CPTPP and RCEP offset the trade war, but not entirely for China and the United States. And then enlargement, if China and 5 other East Asian economies join this into East Asian integration trend, the agreements together dwarf the trade war. They add more than $1 trillion to the global economy. Much of those benefits obviously go to the region itself, and that will make the trade war look like a small pebble in history. Now, all of this is obviously experiments. They are not facts that we expect to see on the ground, although the CPTPP and RCEP do seem very much a part of the Asian economic picture. So with that, I turn the slides over to Mike, and I try to mute myself.
Okay, thanks, Peter, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Just following up a bit on Peter's presentation, I thought I'd start talking about the trade effects that we have with the trade war and with RCEP, and just to look and see what this does in terms of affecting bilateral and regional trade flows. And this first slide looks at the effects of the trade war on global trade patterns. And what you see is actually a very large effect on trade. In fact, by that 2030 that Peter was mentioning, world trade declines by almost $1 trillion a year. Now, most of that is because of the trade war directly affecting the United States and China. Chinese exports to the United States fall by $723 billion per year. US exports to China drop by $193 billion. But if you look at this chart, you'll see a lot of red spaces, and those red spaces show pairs of flows that decline, and you see a lot of red there. So it's not just US-China, it is globally you're seeing a large effect of the trade war because of the effects that it has on disrupting some supply chains and these sorts of things. So you see a fairly significant effect, I would argue, on these trade patterns. If you look at essentially the only white spaces that you see are, U.S. imports from RCEP countries and row, and Chinese exports to RCEP countries and row. Peter, could you give me the next slide? Okay, this shows the trade effects of RCEP, and we include these both for if you will, we have two different scenarios, which is what we use in the study. One is if we had sort of a snapback to where the pre-Trump administration was in terms of its trade protection, et cetera. And that's what we call here business as before. And then we've got the trade war scenario. And if you look at it, this is what we get the effects of RCEP. And the green cells show increases. And the biggest increases you see here is what you see an increase in global trade by about $500 billion from RCEP, which is actually quite significant if you keep in mind that, as Peter said, most of these countries have free trade areas with each other. You'll see especially large trade flows increasing between China and Northeast Asia, between China, Japan, and Korea, other RCEP countries. And this suggests that you're going to see a big increase in Northeast Asian economic integration. As Peter mentioned, Northeast Asia is the one region that doesn't have a significant trilateral free trade area, but that is something that RCEP would create. And this has a very important effect, arguably, in integrating these economies. In fact, if you look at that, $500 billion increase in trade flows, about 88% of it, both in the business as before and the trade war scenarios, are accountable by Northeast Asia, China, Japan, and Korea. So what we're going to be seeing, and this shows up in the numbers with the modeling, is that, for example, advanced manufacture production between the three countries will increase significantly, making Northeast Asia much more competitive in those areas with the United States and with Europe. Peter, next slide. That's the last slide. Okay. All right. So in any event, as Peter said, we don't want to go on too long with this, but I think if we, looking at the results of this modeling, we see that to the extent that the U.S. is decoupling due to the trade war, this is going to be amplified by RCEP, and if you look at the paper, by CPTPP with the United States outside of that. And that has economic implications. As Peter underscored, we shouldn't exaggerate how important that is for the US economy, but it also has strategic implications as well that we don't talk about that much in the paper, not being economists, but it is very real in East Asia. The region would like to have the United States, the region more as a balance to China, and this process of regional integration without the United States could have a centrifugal effect of isolating the United States. It also suggests that China's already dominant economy is going to further integrate with the region. And we saw, 50% of the effects of RCEP are really accounted for by China. And so that's going to have the effect of increasing the economic integration between China and its East Asian neighbors. And then, so we have to ask ourselves, what is going to be China's next step? And there are a few choices, as Peter mentioned to start off. One, it could use its expanded role to support open regionalism and a rule-based system. This seems to be the priority that President Xi has. It's what he's been saying for the last few years about when he gives his support of the WTO, and he talks about an open marketplace. And so that is one direction in which it could go. Another direction, however, is that it could use its dominant position as a leverage for its own advantage in the region. And that could be, could use that for better access, for, it's already had some criticisms about, creating debt traps and these sorts of things. And so this is another direction it could go into. And we argue that, economically and strategically, China really would do well to embrace the former option, that is to support open regionalism. It is already getting, one would say, the beginnings of some isolation, if you will, in terms of its diplomatic relationships with a number of countries, and taking on that role as an advocate of global integration, of open markets and a rule-based system will go a long way to if you will, mollify some of the concerns that its neighbors and others have. And finally, we argue that in this recent paper, but in a paper we published at the Peterson Institute last year, that China's joining the CPTPP would reinforce that strategy. Peter mentioned that a bit in the beginning. If you look at the CPTPP, it's a very advanced agreement, and some of its chapters are already being adopted by other modern cutting-edge agreements, because it really did do a lot to push the frontier of the rule-based international system. And a lot of the chapters in the CPTPP would actually apply disciplines that the United States and Europeans have been criticizing China about over the last 10 years. It's got chapters on, competitive neutrality for state-owned enterprises. It's got chapters on intellectual property protection and trade secrets. It's got a chapter on, foreign direct investment and data localization. All of these things we've all been reading about in the paper as being a center point of US-China disputes. If China were to start negotiations with the CPTPP and move in that direction, it would go a long way to alleviate a lot of the fears the countries have, as well as potentially leading to a very large increase in global income. So we don't know which direction China will go into, but we really do believe that would be the best direction. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Peter and Michael, for that very clear and very compelling case that you're making about the disconnect, and perhaps what I phrased somewhere else as that intra-Asian integration was outpacing trans-Pacific integration. And that could increase further under your model, I gather, under China joining CPTPP and others joining CPTPP, but also the RCEP. So as we go to the Q&A section, let me start off with a couple of comments and then I'll turn to Q&A. Now, I get the regionalization argument. In the early 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, of course, there was that kind of regionalization impulse, the EU integrating North America under NAFTA, et cetera, et cetera. I wonder if one avenue, what you think the prospects for the US to do strategic agreements, such as with UK, it comes and goes, waxes and wanes about an agreement with India. Back on the deck is this TTIP that kind of was lost steam in the last few years. In other words, one avenue to contend with this modeling that you see of greater intra-Asian integration, absent US, is there sufficient room for the US to work on specific trade deals with post-Brexit UK, India, revived TTIP, in order to pick up gains that might be lost in Asia? So that's one kind of question of bridging regionalization and globalization through that strategy. The second is and I don't know about your modeling because I'm not an economist or a modeler, certainly, but I guess one query I do have is one hears on and off that China is becoming more integrated. All the data clearly suggest that. But might China also pursue a nationalist path? One hears about China 2025 in light of some of the responses of US allies and partners regarding China's economic statecraft, putting restrictions on Chinese FDI, putting some restrictions on security in strategic areas, making more restrictions on IPR, decoupling from Huawei. There are a whole bunch of economic statecraft, illegal and legal elements where some allies and partners appear to be going along with the United States concerns on these. Might China adopt a more inward-looking, nationalist, self-reliant posture on that? So those are my sort of two big framing questions, and partially not because at all I agree with that's what's happening, but sort of to push the debate of alternative scenarios to what your modeling suggests. Maybe we'll start there and then I'll turn to Q&A where we're getting questions also. Either one of you or both, or however you want to do it.
So do you want to start and I'll chime in? You're mute.
You're on mute, Peter.
There.
Perfect.
Okay. Interesting questions, Satu. I think your first question is, are the U.S. initiatives, which are, for the time being, the U.S.-UK agreement and the U.S.-India agreement, will those offset East Asia? Frankly, I just don't see that. I mean, I see the level of intensity of trade between these countries is nowhere near the level where U.S.-East Asian relations are. The UK is not a fast-growing country. India is, but it is still, in terms of the size of its economy, much smaller than the others that we have been discussing. So I don't think these provide a good plan B. Now, the question is, what might provide a good plan B? I'm not sure, but clearly some engagement, some efforts to sustain engagement with East Asia, and I'm not sure what form they take or how long they take, would seem to me the necessary U.S. policy. Now, you raised the question of, is China itself becoming nationalist? And to some extent it is. And I'm sure that the trade war has further strengthened the hand of those in China who, especially in terms of technology, want to pursue a very independent nationalist approach, in part because the interdependence of Chinese technology with US technology, as we are seeing in the case of several major companies, has turned out to be a tremendous vulnerability for Chinese firms and indeed for the economy as a whole. So, but that said, China is very aware that the big difference between China and the United States, even in these times when the United States is not playing a leadership role in the world, is the lack of the alliance system, which the United States relies on, and that they just don't have the kind of friends that we have. And so I have a sense that there is, at the same time, that there is concern about making sure that the technology is developed and available in China. At the same time, they are very, very concerned about building better relations around the world, and especially in East Asia. So I don't see, I think this choice that Mike outlined between being kind of China first in the region versus trying to establish a mutually beneficial set of relationships. I think there will be many voices within China that will argue for the latter, and there are very clear economic benefits to doing that, even aside from trying to make sure that technology is to a large extent China-based. But let me just say on the technology side too, Japan and Korea have great complementarities with China in the area of technology, and indeed have had very strong relationships with China already in those areas, and those might be also intensified.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Michael, did you have any thoughts?
Just a couple of things to complement that on this, the merging of these bilaterals. You know, when we all were looking at bilaterals at the beginning of the 21st century were saying, well, does this make sense to have all these bilaterals? What are the efficiency costs in a world of regional production networks of having these bilaterals? And then this idea of regional agreements, mega regional agreements came out to sort of have cumulative rules of origin, to make it more efficient to have these regions, get rid of this Asian noodle effect and these sorts of problems. So when U.S. negotiators led the TPP, that was a big justification for doing this. We don't want to have these inefficient small agreements. We want to have it general, be more consistent. It'll be better for open markets. And by the way, let's keep it open. Let's make it a modern agreement. And if we go back to looking at bilaterals, I think we're going exactly in the wrong direction. And if I look at some of these bilaterals you've been talking about, most of them, in my view, and the economics I've seen about them, those bilaterals are either insignificant or actually going in the wrong direction. I mean, is NAFTA a better agreement now? I mean, I know some economists, they call it NAFTA 0.8 because it actually goes backwards. So I think that the regional approach has that logic that I think makes sense.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me now turn to the Q&A section, which is quite active. And forgive me, I'll do my best to try to take a range and try to combine where I can, so bear with me. And please also understand that I will read the questions simply because we are live on YouTube stream, and our YouTube joiners for this program are unable to see the questions and the comments, so it helps them to know what you're responding to. One question here is really about Japan specifically, but also about this Northeast Asia, the big players, China, Japan, South Korea. And there are a couple of questions phrased in different ways, so let me try to combine them here. Our colleague, Dr. Ellen Frost asked, what assumptions did you make about Japan? And to what extent does your scenario describing closer integration amongst China, South Korea, and Japan depend on vigorous growth in Japan and at least some easing of tension between Japan and South Korea? And another colleague in this same category of kind of Northeast Asia integration asks, what about, this is an anonymous attendee asks, what about their efforts to iron out a trilateral FTA? Do you see it as complementing or superseding CPTPP or RCEP? And we've heard about this, China, Korea, Japan, the CJK thing for years and years and years. And, it just seems to me that we're currently Japan, China, Japan, South Korea, even Korea-China tensions are quite significant obstacles to achievement. So what is your impression? What are your assessment of this?
Should I take a quick shot at it, Peter? And then, okay. Well, to Ellen's point, in the modeling, we don't go into a lot of the dynamics, the strategic dynamics of those negotiations and things. We're modeling these big agreements, and so we're going to have to make simplifying assumptions. One assumption was to put in, when we have the trade war, we assumed it was going to be the phase 1 trade war. And these things, we don't sort of talk about what happens when you've got a disruption in these policies. This is just a long run model, and one hopes that some of these things get smoothed over the longer term. But in terms of ironing out the trilateral, I mean, there is a bilateral free trade area between South Korea and China, which is very superficial, and people really haven't done much with it because of the launch of a trilateral free trade area. But as you know, a trilateral free trade area is politically fraught as well and very difficult. So in the readings I show, it's sort of like the RCEP becomes the substitute for this, for a trilateral. In other words, it makes it easier to have a Northeast Asian free trade area if it's done in the context of RCEP. And I think our results that we talked about earlier suggest that, hey, the RCEP story is a lot of a Northeast Asian story. So I think it supports that.
Peter, did you have any thoughts on the Northeast Asia situation?
We know that Japan is obviously trying to walk a very fine line between a huge regional trade partner and at the same time it's long alliances with the United States and its concerns, frankly, about Chinese behavior in the East Asian region. So Japan is in a very tight, probably in the tightest spot among all of the regional countries in this respect. But you know, the number of areas of tension have diminished over the last few years. There have been visits. There was going to be a visit by President Xi to Japan this summer. That seems to have fallen apart as a result of the Hong Kong, the Chinese Hong Kong steps. But there have been efforts on both sides, on both the Chinese side and on the Japanese and Korean side, to try to explore. They've returned to the CJK discussions. Whether to call them negotiations or not, I'm not sure. But anyway, I mean, all of these things are in progress. And I suspect people are just really waiting for November 3rd in the United States to figure out what's going to happen and the consequences of the US election, to figure out what's going to happen. But they cannot, I think, these countries being so close to China, so closely tied to its economy, cannot ignore these trends and cannot sort of remain unaffected by them.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, I must, just on this theme, you know, one of the things I thought was really strategically, you're economist, so you may think of these numbers a little bit differently, but strategically, I thought one of the big payoffs of TPP was having Japan in. And that seemed to me, from both a strategic point of view, not to mention economic point of view, really a massive argument in favor of TPP in my personal judgment. But since then, obviously for things we all know, Japan, it seems to me, has been quite deft, pushing CPTPP, being part of RCEP, cutting a kind of, if you will, I don't know how you as economists would, but a trade agreement light bilateral with the United States, staying on board on economic statecraft. Is this kind of straddling at some point not going to be possible? Are people going to have to make choices one way or the other, especially if China decides to pull a big strategic card like join CPTPP and set the rules and standards that Michael was alluding to, referring to? Might this mean that you can't straddle anymore? You can't have a bilateral light and a CPTPP and negotiate? What do you think? Are we being pressed not only in integration, but pressed in making a choice?
Let me take a first stab at that, Mike. You might have some thoughts too. My guess is that, you know, first of all, we don't know what choice there is to be made at this point. I think it's going to take Japan and the rest of the world some years to figure out whether there is a kind of extreme choice that has to be made between China and the United States. And I think most countries in the world are hoping that they don't have to do that. That is, that they will be able to maintain their close relationships with the US and at the same time build these very lucrative economic ties with China at the same time. The US-Japan trade deal was a very strange one. It basically said, give us everything you gave everybody else in the TPP without us giving you anything in return, except maybe not imposing tariffs on your car exports to the United States. But that's still on the table, I guess, back in somebody's mind. So it was not for Japan an alternative to the, or even a shadow of the TPP itself. And I think what pushing forward with the CPTPP meant for Japan is exactly what we described, an unpleasant but the best available way of sustaining integration and its interdependence on, and Japan does depend on trade. I mean, it's doesn't depend as much on trade as many of the other countries in the region. But it does depend on trade, and it needs to build stronger ties. Now, Japan, among all of the regional countries, is perhaps the one that is most ambitious in looking outward from the region, aside from the United States. So they've concluded the EU agreement, and they are evidently working on a UK agreement as well. So Japan is, by the way, I mean, the UK itself is interested in the CPTPP potentially. So it may be that this East Asia-centric bloc grows not just in East Asia, but pulls in some non-regional partners eventually.
Michael, anything? Otherwise, I'll go back to the queue.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think I think we could also talk about Australia's role in all this, but something we haven't mentioned is, we used to have a grand vision of where we saw the Asia Pacific going. If you look at the Yokohama vision of 2010, the APEC Yokohama vision, and it was, okay, what we'd like to do is by 2020, start thinking about ended up being called the free trade area of the Asia Pacific. And to get there, we'd go through different pathways. One pathway would be the TPP, which had already started, and the other would be some sort of East Asian pathway, which we could define now as being RCEP. The question, and that was really a vision, because once you come at the end of that and you look at the FTAEP, you have got all of these countries involved in that sort of a thing. And then you've got a major trade presence. It's got a majority of global trade. And then all of a sudden you start thinking about, well, if there's a deal between that and the EU, aren't we building up a open global economy from the ground up? I mean, that used to be a vision. Right now, we probably in our audience, we're getting people that are chuckling at that a bit. But I thought that was actually an interesting vision, which would get around a lot of these issues that you're talking about.
Apropos that, just as a segue, one of the questions in our queue was about APEC. I mean, you talked about the vision now of Yokohama and the APEC vision, maybe less pressing or clear, but is APEC itself alive and well? Is it relevant anymore under the conditions that we've seen over the last few years? Either or both of you?
Well, Peter, you're mute. He's done that on purpose. He's mute on purpose.
I was mute on purpose.
That's what Michael said.
Yeah. So I mean, I think both Mike and I have worked quite a bit with various APEC forums and have good relationship with them. It's lying low, and because there is so much distrust within the organization. On the other hand, it's doing very interesting work. There is, for example, a very strong digital initiative, which addresses many of the issues that the people are trying to address in Geneva in the plurilateral negotiations on digital trade. And the Chinese are there, and the Americans are there. So it may be one of the last places where there is a relatively easy exchange between the two countries on issues that really matter for the world. So I don't know what to say about it. It has clearly fallen off the very high-level interactions that drove, for example, the Yokohama vision some years ago.
Let me turn to some questions around a kind of theme and bunch a couple together from Mr. or Miss Sharma. And it's really about the impact of trade agreements on what I gather from the query here are about lesser developed countries. They ask, one question relates to trade benefits seem to go to large, big infrastructure countries like China, Japan, or Korea, while developing nations such as India, Bangladesh, others run large deficits. And corollary questions in this theme of impacts of these RCEP and trade agreements on developing countries are, is it a way for China to dump goods and thus nullify the effects of the trade war because of restrictions in the US? And what is the relationship, if any, to the Belt and Road Initiative agreements? Might these, in fact, the debt acquired by some of the developing countries, might they undermine trade agreements? So sort of what is the impact on some of the lesser developed countries of Indo-Pacific?
Those are excellent questions. I think as a first pass, I think if you look at the modeling we've done of, say, TPP and CPTPP, it's often the lower income countries that, relative to their income, do the best because it brings down barriers to trade on a comprehensive basis rather than just isolating out areas which usually exclude them. Also, I think this deep integration that you see from initiatives such as the CPTPP actually can help a lot in closing development gaps because it allows some of these lower income countries to actually plug into regional production networks. And something that wasn't possible in the past. And in fact, if you look at the ASEAN Economic Community, which is built on 4 pillars, and one of them is sort of, a more equitable region, they are counting on these regional production networks as a way of closing development gaps because in a traditional, sort of without the regional production networks, you had foreign direct investment in the middle income or high income countries, whereas when you have fragmented trade and dispersed foreign direct investments in various countries at all levels get involved, and that allows them to plug in, and there's technology transfers that could come into that, a lot of positive things. So I think that actually, even though our modeling shows that they tend to be big winners, we're probably underestimating the positive benefits that they would have. And of course, something like the Belt and Road Initiative, talking about the debt trap is another seminar perhaps, but I think the fact that the focus on infrastructure in order to advance integration is only to their benefit. And if you look at, we haven't talked much about the WTO, but if you look at the Doha Development Round, one of the only 2 initiatives, or the 2 initiatives that came out of it, one was a trade facilitation agreement, and the other was an aid for trade agreement. And that was development assistance specifically to help lower income countries integrate into the global system by having additional assistance funds for infrastructure, hard and soft. And I think this all could be part of the package with these things. Trade facilitation is very important in these arrangements. So.
Peter, did you have any thoughts on those questions? No, okay. So maybe I'll turn to some other queries here. One is on the issue of technology in your modeling. Hildegun Nordas asks, to what extent have you been able to capture the prohibition of selling sensitive inputs to Huawei in your trade war scenario? This seems to be a make or break type of thing rather than a marginal effect. And that's a very interesting question to me. I mean, we hear a lot about Huawei on security grounds, but where does it fit into the context of actually, the trade impact?
Peter, you want to?
If I can talk to this, Hildegun is right. We are seeing something very new in the world economy, which is kind of technological protectionism instead of the more conventional type, where most of the products that were excluded were, let's say, products made by low-wage countries, so that you didn't want your domestic labor to have to compete with low-wage workers. But this is very different. This is essentially efforts to find key points of technological vulnerability especially of large firms which are attempting to make a dent in international markets, and use those essentially to keep those firms from competing. And our modeling doesn't capture that. It doesn't capture well the kind of technological requirements that a firm needs to have to be able to compete internationally. In fact, some colleagues at the WTO, we were thinking about actually developing a model. There are some models like that, but not incorporated in global trade models that look at the technological decoupling, the effects of technological decoupling. But I mean, a lot of trade is not that. A lot of trade is much more standard supply chains operating on electronic products, on automobile parts, and so on. And I think this is a turn that the trade war has taken more recently than our modeling was based on, being based on the very standard phase one kinds of assumptions. And I think it could have very significant effects in time.
Thank you. Michael, would you like to comment at all on that?
That's,
Okay. Let me turn to a couple of interesting questions. One from Sam Driggers and one from Jonathan Wolfish. And these relate to different subregions. And it's kind of an interesting take on this meta picture of RCEP and CPTPP and China joining, et cetera. Sam Driggers asks about what might subnational entity states on the west coast of the US pursue? I know Sam is involved very much in trade and investment in California. I mean, here is, what is it, the 6th, 7th largest economy in the world. I mean, I'm not quite sure the number or rank, but obviously it has regulations regarding emissions. It has all kinds of implications for what you can sell in the California market, as it were. So what might you suggest under the scenarios you're seeing for, and on the other side of the pond, in Asia, Mr. Wolfish asks, what are your thoughts on the Greater Bay Area project that intends to further integrate Hong Kong, Macau, and mainland China? What impacts might this have on global and regional trade? So those sort of two sub-regional, where do they fit within this meta picture of global trade and modeling and outcomes?
Well, taking Jonathan's question on the Greater Bay Area, I'm not sure it's going to make that much of a difference. Those economies are already very closely integrated. I think it's the question, what happens with the Hong Kong economy with the recent sanctions and these sorts of things. But Macau is very much specialized in a few sectors, including the service sector. Hong Kong is extremely closely integrated in Guangdong province and with China. So I don't think that's going to make that big of a difference. And in terms of the San Francisco Bay area, et cetera, and these sub-regional things, I'll let Peter answer that since he's based in the US.
We have a vice presidential candidate now from California, Peter, so your comments will be mostly...
I'm not sure how much of a free hand California has in making U.S. international foreign policy, but I think the connections between California and East Asia have been very, very strong. I mean, the population flows, technology flows, money flows, students. I mean, it's every way you can imagine. And I think it would hurt California a lot, as it would hurt Boston, Massachusetts, where I'm located. To have a kind of very aggressive decoupling of East Asia from the United States. I hope that won't happen. Let me just add that the one interesting part of the Bay Area project is that, China is really kind of bearing down on its southern provinces and on its large southern cities as a kind of leader of its economy. You used to think of just the east coast of China being but it's now, one could argue it's this southern zone where a lot of the technological advances and strong stock markets, financial advances are coming. So Mike's question is right. We don't know exactly where Hong Kong will fit into that. Hong Kong would have, in its old form, Hong Kong would have fitted very nicely into that Bay Area as an opening to the South and to the United States and other parts of the world. So economically very powerful area. Its connections remain to be defined, I think, with the rest of the world.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We are at noon, but I'm going to extend it. I know some people will have to jump off the call or the YouTube live stream. But I'm going to go ahead and just try to get a couple of things in, sort of in closing, kind of, because we are where we are, meaning at least the East-West Center here in Washington. And we are, at the time we are, which is on the cusp of a national election in the United States, will have, some bearing on maybe not complete bearing, but some bearing on the outlook. So let me ask a couple of political questions that have come through the chat. How should President Biden, in this case, according to the questions, this is not a partisan statement, the person asks, think a President Biden would specifically handle TPP? And given the, in fact, in a way more important, given the highly critical nature of globalization, I think I wrote down a very interesting formulation, Peter, that you had, which is the risk of national supply chains. Quite right, quite right. But in the politics of the times, the resilience of national supply chains seems to be getting more of a bang for your buck than the risk of national supply chains, particularly on things like pharmaceuticals and protective equipment under COVID, and your title is about COVID. What do you think? What do you think should be the strategy going forward? What do you think will be the strategy going forward? You're looking over your shoulder.
Okay, I just let me. I think Peter would be better at answering the supply chain question. But I think what happens under President Biden. I think that I don't think we're going to get a lot of good indications of that over the next few months, because in an election year, trade is always used as a punching bag, and so it's going to be about who can be more anti-China, who can be. It seems to me more inward looking, but I think that what we've seen over time often is the United States makes its most of its progress, and Peter can disagree with me with this. It seems to me is when you've got a moderate Democrat as president leading some of these negotiations with support of Republicans, because it used to be the Republican Party was pro-free trade and would have the support of the president. And I think that's why Obama was able to make some significant initiatives, at least in that regard. And I think that maybe you would see Biden find himself in a new position to do that. Now, I don't know what the Republican Party means in that scenario where Biden wins. I don't know what happens to the Republican Party. But I do think that the Democratic, that Biden himself understands the importance of coalitions, of cooperation, and of open markets. So I think that he would certainly be willing. I'm not sure if he's going to do it, but he certainly would be more inclined to go back to the sort of Obama approach than if you saw a second term for President Trump.
But presumably in the second administration, not in the first, just like Obama really moved on trade in the second term rather than the first.
Right.
Particularly
could be, but Obama did not inherit a policy like Biden is going to inherit. So I think that I don't know to what degree that raises the stakes some, I think, because I'm in a continent right now in Europe that they really are wondering, how reliable the United States is globally. I mean, I'm not far from Geneva, and what's going on with the WTO seems to be the US being isolated. Now, might argue that where the US is right about the need of reform and everything, all we know here is you're actually having a dispute settlement mechanism workaround that's being used because the U.S. is blocking any new appellate judges and things, and so it's a different situation.
Thank you very much, Peter. Yeah, a couple of points. I think one big difference that I think we would see with Biden as opposed to Trump is a return to multilateral engagement. I mean, there would be discussions with Europe, certainly with Japan, with Australia, so a kind of broad effort to take stock of the problems that the world faces in a multilateral way. And I think that ultimately would also help the US-China confrontation, because it would create, I think, a more reasonable but a more powerful position that China would have to take very seriously if it values integration with the world economy, which I think for their own sake, they need to value. ultimately for their own economic stake. And that leads me to my other point is I don't know about the short run much beyond what I just said. I'm not a political scientist, and I'm certainly not I don't read tea leaves, but I do have the sense that in the long run, the situation we now have is untenable. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for two extraordinarily powerful economies with terrific interdependent technologies to be so at odds in terms of their relations, economic and otherwise. So I am hoping that with time, possibly with change of leaders on all sides, one gets to a point where we cannot recover sort of what there was under Obama. That's sort of history, but find a way for us to construct a global economy and a global kind of political environment in which there are not such severe threats hanging over every firm's or every political decision as there are today. So I think the multilateral approach, which Biden would, I think, take even very early on, would ultimately help to lead there.
Well, on that very, very hopeful note, that we will get back to a sort of multilateralism that allows us to cooperate on Indo-Pacific, U.S. Indo-Pacific trade and investment and commercial relations. I want to thank our presenters, Michael Plummer and Peter Petrie. Once again, your long-standing association with the East-West Center is highly valued and very welcome. And I thank you for taking the time, Michael, over in Europe, in Bologna, and Peter up in Massachusetts. Thank you so much for taking an hour with us. We had a great turnout. I know many people on YouTube, which we can't count, but almost 70 people on the Zoom call. And thank you all participants for your very active engagement with the Q&A section. I hope you will read the paper to which Peter and Michael referred. We have put that link in the Zoom webinar chat section, and so you can get access to that paper with the link that Sarah has put in. Let me just say that we have additional programs for our webinar series, both for our alumni series, 60 Minutes for the 60th anniversary, as well as other programs coming up, including on the US-China education relationship through a new General Accounting Office study of the US-China higher education sector. So there's lots of issues that relate to today's discussion, as well as new and other issues. So please join us at the East-West Center. And again, let me close by thanking Michael Plummer and Peter Petrie for a terrific webinar today on US-Asia trade. Thanks so much indeed. Good day, everyone. Be safe and healthy, please. Bye-bye.